Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-part series, which is brought to you with support from the Global Environmental Justice Documentary Film Collection, my guests and I will be discussing the benefits and techniques behind using documentary films as instruction and research tools. Joining me are Becky Overmeyer Velasquez, Associate Professor of Sociology at Whittier College, Jake Carbine, Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Associate Professor of Religious Studies, also at Whittier, and Gary Marcuse, Project Director at Face to Face Media, the producer of the GEJ documentaries. We'll be using the Global Environmental Justice Documentaries collection as a jumping-off point and centerpiece for our discussions, and earning a highly recommended rating in Choice Reviews. The GEJ Film Collection currently contains 48 documentary films and teacher's guides focus on environmental justice themes relating, for now, to Asia and North America. The collection got its start in 2019 at Whittier College when Gary, Jake, and Becky began collaborating on the initial curation of film titles and the design of the teacher's guides. Further curation and teacher guide authorship were provided by a growing list of faculty from Whittier and other institutions, and funding from the Henry Luce Foundation supported the growth and distribution of the platform. The collection is aimed at the undergraduate level, but the films are also suitable for secondary and postgraduate use. Importantly for this series, however, is the invaluable insight we get from Jake and Becky into the ways in which teaching faculty use documentary films and GEJ's custom teacher's guides as highly effective pedagogical tools. We'll learn about how faculty help curate the collection, write the guides, and how documentaries are most effectively incorporated into instruction. In this final episode of our 4-part series, we look at the metrics and engagement behind the GEJ film collection and discuss what those numbers reveal about how the films are being used in instruction. So let's talk about engagement and reach, and a little bit is kind of on the business side, so we'll pull Gary into some of this. But currently, Gary, how many institutions are using GEJ film content in their instruction?
As of this week, I think the number is just 80 plus.
Okay.
And that even more than the number of, we get metrics back on each of the films that they've watched, and we can even break it down with a little effort by looking at each of the institutions and what they're using. One of the things that won't surprise you is that we found that Whittier College is one of the top users of this collection because they thought about it so much and it's penetrated deeply into the curricula. And so it's widely used, and I think librarians take note of that kind of thing as well. We make these kind of the data available to them as well. I think what's interesting is that when we first did this, we had this problem with documentaries being way too long for a course. It's hard to show a 70-minute documentary in a 45 or 50-minute class.
Right.
So we evolved a kind of a technique of trying to make sure that there are a sufficient number of clips that can totaling maybe 20 minutes or less that teachers could use to start a discussion. And there may even be a specific set of questions that would relate to those clips because we're just very conscious of the value of teachers' times and the scarcity of it and the need to be able to accommodate a standard length class. And so throughout the collection, all 48 of them, anything that's longer than 30 minutes has a suggested set of clips that you could use when time is short. Mm-hmm. And we then went back and looked at what has been the result of the screenings that we've done. How much engagement is there? What we get is every time a student turns on or a classroom teacher, we don't know who's watching, but every time they tune into one of the films, it marks as a film viewed, and then we can see how long the viewing held for each of those techniques. Not a surprising question, but very interestingly, we found that the average viewing time was 24 minutes, which is better than you see in the commercial world where people drop in and bounce and don't stick around for more than a minute and a half or 2 minutes. The students or the classes are watching a full 22 to 24 minutes every time they turn it on the average. And since some of the films are even short, that means that some of the longer films are also being watched in their entirety. Some of the films like Under the Dome, which is from China about smog and pollution, there's 2.5 hours. So we don't expect to see everybody watching the whole thing, but we do see that they're watching a good solid 20-minute excerpt from it, which is sufficient to help teachers start a nice classroom discussion. So that kind of matrix comes back for us. We've had overall 16,000 screenings since we opened this project about 3 years ago. Which is a pretty good number. And as one of the librarians pointed out to me, that's more than 300,000 minutes of active watching of environmental justice films. So all that feels pretty good. It suggests that intuitively we're on the right course. If we can grow the number of libraries participating and subscribing, because there are real sponsors, if we can grow that number to about 100 libraries, then we'll have escaped the need for more grants and the project will be self-sustaining.
Right.
So there's a lovely moment when that can happen.
Yeah. So, you were talking about the metrics, Gary, and I'm wondering, and Becky and Jake, you're welcome to jump in on this. Like, what do those numbers reveal about how the films are being used in instruction, if anything? I mean, is there any insight you're gleaning from that? And, and that might hypothetically, impact the way you in the future collect and curate these films, and then, as you mentioned earlier, look for clips that are worth using. What are those numbers revealing to you?
Well, those clips would all be selected by the faculty who are writing the guides.
Mm.
So we have that going on. One thing that we can tell is which films are being used the most, what's the trend in terms of what teachers are looking for. But some of the films are only used by a very small number of faculty, but that's fine. We don't need to have every one of them be equally popular.
Yep.
But there's a film called The True Cost, which looks at the fast fashion industry in Southeast Asia and the kind of the problems that come from those kinds of highly polluting industries with poor working conditions, dangerous working conditions. Lots of issues are raised by each of them. And a film that I had initially thought was okay, spent a lot of time looking at those issues. And when I began to get the numbers back, I realized it's more than okay. It accounts for almost a quarter of our viewing, which reflects, I think, the fact is that there was already an audience for those kinds of issues, and they found their way to our collection, and they're making really great use of it with, sometimes tens of thousands of views. So that tells me maybe we should provide more examples of that. Found another film called River Blue, which is specifically about the manufacturing of denim, but it explores the impact on global rivers and, in fact, on the global ocean as well. So we can kind of follow the usage and make sure that we're adding more. I think there was a growing interest in the initial 2 films we had for African American studies, and that rapidly expanded now to 4 or 5 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And people were quite interested in stories that looked at sustainable forestry, particularly in Indonesia, where small indigenous groups have been able to recapture control of their land and now have developed what they think is a solution to the global issues from their point of view. They're doing sustainable forestry and in a way that is quite common with indigenous groups around the globe. So that opens up a whole discussion of indigenous issues from a new angle with a very positive description of the way in which they, through their values, tend to kind of monitor and preserve and husband the environment that they live in. So I think we can get arrows pointing to new topics, I think, and sometimes people just suggest new films to us. But overall, the collection of the metrics on that help us make those decisions.
Mm-hmm. And then Jake and Becky, I mean, I don't know if you have access to those numbers or not, but I mean, does that kind of make sense to you in terms of like
Well,
what they're revealing?
we've used the true cost, so I can definitely confirm that students are really interested in fast fashion. I mean, it's
Mm,
something they participate in, and I think they understand it better. And this is a very connected generation. They're learning a lot on TikTok,
mhm.
believe it or not. There's a lot going on there, and um, the true cost is very savvy the way that they've made that film, and they have connections, they have internet, online resources, and other. They really nicely connect you to a lot of contemporary, current issues that are related to fast fashion sources, I should
Okay.
say. So yeah, I'm not surprised about that. Gary, that would be good to have an updated version of that. I guess something like that. Maybe more along the lines of, well, what is the alternative? That film takes a does spend a lot of time on what do we do what do we do instead of fast fashion. Well, how do we clothe ourselves in a way that's sustainable? So maybe a focus on that would be fantastic for students to see. But yeah.
Excellent. So Jake and Becky are both professors in the humanities and social sciences, as we've learned, respectively. Can you just give us a sense, for more broadly, maybe what the potential of a platform or a collection of films like that GEJ has, how that, what the potential is for that to be used for instruction in classrooms of all kinds or disciplines of all kinds? How more broadly, how does this, how can we be using this more?
I have the sort of the two quick case studies to refer to, and both of them are courses that I co-taught. One of the courses is the globalization introduction to globalization with Becky, and that's the course in which we use the true cost together, and we have the students sort of do the kinds of things, engage in the kinds of ways that Gary and Becky have been talking about. And so there's sort of is an inherent sort of interdisciplinary conversation between us. Oftentimes, we learn that the issues that we are looking at are not siloed. They have many different intersections with a whole range of different issues, and that perspectives from different disciplines are really beneficial in terms of unpacking and talking about them and thinking through how issues might be addressed. So there's that sort of dynamic with that we had with the globalization course. The other was a course dealing with Burma, and that I did with a professor in the natural sciences a few years ago on sacred space and biodiversity. And we used some segments from some GEG films to sort of like the Dams, Drugs, and Democracy to help contextualize Burma's recent history and other things. And religion does play a important role in that documentary, but in ways very different than what we were doing with the course. But that was sort of in preparation for getting over into Burma and actually doing sort of a mini research project on sacred space and biodiversity. And we had different measures of how we were doing those things. But there's a kind of a power that's enabled at the conversational level, at the level of reflecting on different places in the world in all sorts of unanticipated ways. I mean, if you had told me when when I arrived at Whittier that I'd be going and doing a sacred space and biodiversity course with a colleague in the natural sciences, I would have said, "Oh, that sounds cool. What did I ever do with that?" But on the other hand, that's the kind of space that gets opened up by this kind of platform. I think it helps to bring that together.
Yeah.
Becky, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I'm thinking too about our curricular change at Whittier College. So we've been going through a renewal of our liberal education curriculum, the requirements, and a complete change really in the orientation of the curriculum, but also at the heart of how we teach. So a pedagogical shift. And it reminds me of the ways in which, films like this can be so integral to helping students see the real world implications of everything that they're learning in the classroom, including, say, definitely like in a chemistry classroom. I mean, how great would it be for a chemistry class to look at clothing dyes, the dyes that are used in the fashion industry, and understand better at the chemistry of the pollution that those dyes cause in all over the world, right? And think about the public health impact. So we have a public health minor, for example, that would benefit from using these kinds of films to help students see the global concerns about pollution and their impacts on public health around the world. So, I think that any of these films lend themselves to that kind of connection to the real world in any discipline, which will enhance student learning because then they understand better the relevance of what they're learning, and it gets them engaged and excited about what they're learning because they see that there's a direct application in some ways to what's going on around them. And so now that we're having this conversation, it's making me think again. I mean, one new part of this curriculum is a real strong focus on experiential learning, and in all the variety of forms that experiential learning can take. But also, we're trying to change the way we teach math, so that and quantitative reasoning, and thinking about ways to engage students across the disciplines in quantitative reasoning. And I think films like this could be a part of that new pedagogical shift. Project-based learning is another modality we're moving into across the disciplines. And the way that Jake is using the films in his class really lend themselves to teamwork that's focused on a particular research topic. So yeah.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So Becky, Jake, and Gary, that's all the time we have. So thank you so much for joining us on the program.
It's been
a
great.
pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure too. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You just heard from Becky Overmeyer-Velasquez, Associate Professor of Sociology at Whittier College, Jake Carbine, Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Associate Professor of Religious Studies, also at Whittier, and Gary Marcuse, Project Director at Face to Face Media, the producer of the GEJ documentaries. This episode is brought to you with support from GEJ. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.